Hello, everyone. Welcome to LGBTQ plus history at Iowa. My name is Doug Kolash, and I graduated from Iowa in 2002 with a BA in Communication Studies in Spanish. And in 2011, I got my MBA at Iowa. And I have the honor of being the first president of the University of Iowa LGBTQ plus alumni group. I can't tell you how excited I am about this group and the great things we have planned for all of our Hawkeye alumni who identify as part of the LGBTQ community, as well as our friends and allies. Before we get started, I want to thank the University of Iowa Center for Advancement for their vision in establishing this alumni group, along with the outstanding guidance and support we've gotten from Kim Chickering and Leah Best, who have been instrumental in helping the board get off the ground and running. I want to briefly introduce the founding members of our board as well. These individuals have been fantastic in putting together a vision for this group. Kate Pace, Tristan Geiser, Lois Gray, Dina Jensen, our communications officer, Jose Diaz, our board secretary, Sarah Johnson, and our vice president, Brock Cavett. Thank you all so much for everything you do. Our entire board is thrilled to present today's forum as the first event that we have sponsored. We wanted to celebrate the first 175 years of our beloved alma mater with a look back at the history of our community on campus and in the state of Iowa. To do that, we have two outstanding presenters to educate and enlighten us. And I want to acknowledge the work of our board member, Lois Gray, who has done so much to coordinate and organize today's forum. We could not have done this without her. Thank you very much, Lois. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Note that for all of our attendees in this format, your camera and microphone are disabled. Closed captioning is available at the bottom of the screen by clicking live transcript, and you could submit questions for our panelists using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen as well. So we encourage those questions. Please take advantage of that. We have the UI Indigenous Land Acknowledgement for you to take a look at here. And while you're reading that, I want to kind of transition on and I'll introduce our moderator. But in this forum, you're going to see that there's so much for us to be proud of when it comes to the University of Iowa and the state of Iowa in terms of the progress we've made for the rights of LGBTQ plus Hawkeyes. However, recent legislation signed by the governor shows that we do still have a lot of work to do to bend the arc of Iowa history towards justice and equality for all. The board hopes that our alumni group can be a part of that work and that you will join us in making a difference. Throughout today's forum, we will share our website, our social media pages with you so that you can stay connected. Now I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's forum, one of our board members, Tristan Geiser, a 2017 graduate of the Tippie College of Business. Tristan is going to introduce us to our fantastic presenters.
Thank you, Doug, and good evening or afternoon, everyone. My name is Tristan Geiser. I use he, him pronouns, and I am thrilled to introduce our speakers for this evening. First off, we have David McCartney, who uses he, him pronouns. David recently retired as a University of Iowa Archivist, a position he held for 21 years. He is the past president of the Midwest Archives Conference. David has chaired the Big Ten College and University Archivists Group and continues to serve on the College and University Archives Steering Committee of the Society of American Archivists. He received master's degrees in history and library science, both from the University of Maryland at College Park, and his bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In 2021, David received a Staff Excellence Award from the Iowa State Board of Regents. David is originally from Charles City and now lives in Iowa City with his husband, James. We also have Aiden Bettine with us. Aiden uses he, him pronouns and is the Community and Student Life Archivist at the University of Iowa Libraries Special Collection and Archives. Aiden is also the executive director of the LGBTQ Iowa Archives and Library based in Iowa City. He's an archivist and a historian who researches and teaches local history pertaining to race, gender, and sexuality in Iowa and the Midwest. In special collections and archives, Aiden supervises an array of oral history projects to help capture diverse student life on our campus and works directly with student organizations to help preserve their history. Aiden holds master's degrees in both library and information sciences and critical ethnic studies. He is completing his interdisciplinary PhD in public history and archival science at the University of Iowa. David and Aiden, the floor is yours.
Kristen, thank you very much. And Doug, thank you also for your very kind introductions and for laying the groundwork for a very exciting opportunity for Aiden and myself to be part of. We're both very honored and pleased to join you all this afternoon for what is really the inaugural event of the new LGBTQ plus affinity group, which has been established by the University of Iowa Center for Advancement. Again, thank you all very much for this opportunity to speak. Aiden and I are going to take a few minutes to share with you a history. It is certainly by no means a definitive history of Iowa City and the University of Iowa with regard to the LGBTQ plus experience in our community, but we're going to touch on a few highlights for the next few minutes. And also, Aiden, I'm going to invite you to jump in at any time, at least in the first portion of our talk, to share with you some moments of history, some reflections on attitudes of earlier times, for better or for worse. It's a very rich and very important history to absorb and to appreciate. The University of Iowa certainly has more than its share of claims to firsts in a number of regards, including the first public university in the United States to officially recognize a gay lesbian student organization. That was over 51 years ago, back in 1970. And also the University of Iowa was the first public university to extend domestic partner benefits to same-sex couples employed by the university. That was in 1993. But we really can't talk about local pride without also talking about the larger picture. What was happening in the United States? What was happening worldwide for gay people in, let's say, in the 1950s? And the author, James Baldwin, answers that question when his book Giovanni's Room was published in 1956. There was quite an uproar over what many considered to be its indecency, depicting gay love in candid and beautiful, really beautiful terms in the way that the literature at the time had failed to capture. James Baldwin succeeded. At one time, and it was probably during this same period, in an interview, James Baldwin said, "I was born Black, gay, and poor. I hit the jackpot." Baldwin also had this to say about our own experiences. Everybody's journey is individual. If you fall in love with a boy, you fall in love with a boy. The fact that many Americans consider it a disease says more about them than it does about homosexuality. Well, indeed, the U.S. does have a long and rather ugly history of systemic racism, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination. The next slide, please. Before Stonewall, this is 1965, and the State Department by this time had for over a decade had been engaged in the practice of sweeping its payroll, its ranks of personnel of avowed, as the term was perhaps used at the time, or suspected homosexuals. And in the summer of 1965, a very brave group of people gathered in front of the State Department in Washington, D.C. to protest these firings. It was an early public act of protest against what had been a federal statute that sanctioned the practice of wholesale dismissal of gay employees. The next slide, please. This headline, and I don't have the full citation, but it is probably from about 1953 or 1954, very much captured the temper of the times. There was considerable fear if you were gay or if you were concerned about being suspected as much, that the government could very well fire you for no reason other than the fact that you were suspected of being gay by somebody who would have reported you. This, we'll go to the next slide, please, was an outcome of Executive Order 10450, which was signed by President Dwight Eisenhower in 1953. And the language states, any criminal, infamous, dishonest, immoral, or notoriously disgraceful conduct, habitual use of intoxicants to excess, drug addiction, or sexual perversion. This section was interpreted to mean that it could apply to sexual minorities, including LGBTQ plus people. The next slide, please. The Lavender Scare documentary, which I believe was released in 2019, touches on this theme as well. And the climate of fear of that time cannot be underestimated or understated. 1951, here's the front page of the Daily Iowan from the April 26, 1951 edition. And the story is rather cryptic. It's very tragic. It's a 5-paragraph story that was essentially provided by Iowa City Police about a graduate student who died by suicide at his home on Kirkwood Avenue. This is unfortunately indicative of the climate of fear and hysteria which permeated the entire country during this time. The fuller narrative of this particular tragedy is recounted in a book that came out about 3 years ago now, in 2019, by David Dowling. Could you go back, please, to the story for a moment? Thank you. There was a very real concern on the part of the police, and for that matter, the young man who took his life, that the full facts of the case not be divulged. And this was the climate of the time. David Dowling's book about the Iowa Writers' Workshop, the title is Delicate Aggression, Savagery and Survival in the Iowa Writers' Workshop, by David Dowling of the journalism faculty here at Iowa. This came out in 2019. It was published by Yale University Press. And this particular case involving Robert Shelley is recounted in more detail in that book. Dowling devotes a chapter to the short but brilliant life of Robert Shelley, who at age 25 chose to end his life. Shelley was already recognized during this time as the workshop's most celebrated poet on the faculty. But as the author noted, Shelley was living in a world of heterosexual normativity, and he was facing considerable pressure on the demands of his work, both as editor and as author, and living in isolation on account of his sexuality. He was both very public and very, very private. And as the iNews item notes, Shelley had been taking treatment at the what was then referred to as the psychopathic hospital periodically for the previous year. As I said, Dowling's book goes into far greater detail about this particularly tragic chapter than we have time for right now, but I recommend David Dowling's book very, very highly. Okay, next slide, please. So indeed, the climate for Iowa's LGBTQ plus citizens can be reflected in our state laws. I went over to the law library at the law school one day to consult past editions of the Code of Iowa. Next slide, please. We go into the index and we see how our conduct, our very being, is indexed. We are criminalized. It is identified as such, as sexual perverts. And we'll go to the next slide. And we see this broken out into various categories. We'll go to the index section that cites offenses against indecency and so forth. And we come to section 4937 of the Iowa Code. Any person who shall commit sodomy shall be imprisoned in the penitentiary for no more than 10 years, nor less than 1 year. This was the law in Iowa and many states. In fact, almost all US states at the time had a law very similar to this on the books. One of the late, if you will, changes in Iowa's statute occurred in 1978, when the Iowa legislature at last decriminalized sodomy and sexual activity between consenting adults. The statutes were finally brought up to date more than 60 years after this particular statute was published. The next slide, please. During the 1960s, there were periodically notices published in the Daily Iowan. This is a notice that appeared in the Daily Iowan in 1967, I believe, in which, again, staff at the campus psychopathic hospital on the medical campus is developing a treatment program for male homosexuals and young men with, quote, homosexual preoccupations. And you are given a phone number and an address if you are interested in participating. What the notice does not say, of course, is what the treatment program involves or what the goal is. This was still several years before before the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its compiled list of mental and psychological disorders. The fact that this notice was embedded in some other rather mundane announcements, such as exemption tests for physical education or odd jobs available through the financial aids office. And oh, by the way, here's a notice about a treatment program in case you might be queer. That's how essentially this was equated back in 1967. The next slide, please. But there were signs of interest and signs of at least, if not acceptance, at least curiosity and open-mindedness. In 1965, a member of the Chicago chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis came to the University of Iowa campus, and she spoke to an engineering college faculty spouses group at the Iowa Memorial Union at a luncheon one day. And Barbara McLean's appearance was well covered the following day in the Daily Iowan. During this time, along with the Daughters of Bilitis, also the Mattachine Society were really the leading mid-20th century homosexual rights advocacy groups. These were organizations that were quite active in the pre-Stonewall period. The next slide, please. Very closeted, but also word of mouth was how gay people met each other in Iowa City for a very long time. And one of the many, not many, but certainly numerous bars in Iowa City over the years that catered on the down low to gay and lesbian customers was Kenny's. And this ad appeared in the Daily Iowan around 1964. The next slide, please. The pink arrow points to Kenny's location. This was on South Clinton Street. We're looking northwest on Clinton. Today, that entire block is the Old Capitol Town Center shopping mall. And if you look carefully toward the back, look closely toward the far right side there, you got the cursor there, thanks Aiden, that's the Pentecrest. And we're at the corner of Clinton and Washington, I believe. No, I'm sorry, Clinton and College, looking northwest. All of those buildings are now gone. But that was Kenny's location. And it was, as I said, a word of mouth place, as so many establishments were during that era. The next slide, please. Gender bending is not an unusual occurrence in fraternities and sororities throughout the years. If you ever peruse the University of Iowa Hawkeye Yearbooks, which were published from 1892 to 1992, and they're all online too in the the Iowa Digital Library. You can peruse and find images like these. This is from the 1943 Hawkeye Yearbook. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the sorority that hosted this, but certainly a fabulous time must have been had by all. The next slide, please. We have a number of noted alumni from the university through the years. One of our few images of Tennessee Williams, Thomas Williams, his formal name. He was an undergraduate student in the Department of Theater Arts here at the University of Iowa during the late 1930s. And that is Mr. Williams on set for a production of Henry IV in 1938. The relationship between Williams and the director of the program at the time, Edward Mabey, was a very difficult, very tense relationship, and Mabey was indeed openly gay baiting Williams, dismissing him for his sexuality, and which Williams had never denied, or indeed he espoused it. And nonetheless, the climate for Tennessee Williams, who became Tennessee Williams, was so tense and so contentious that he decided to transfer back to the University of Missouri and complete his degree there. But he did come out in Iowa City, and in his memoir, he recalls his times with meetups, both on and off campus. The next slide, please. Grant Wood, who served on the faculty in the School of Art and Art History in the mid to late 1930s. He joined the faculty in 1934, about 3 years after his world-renowned work, American Gothic, was released. He served on the faculty until his death in 1942. Again, a very contentious relationship, this time with Lester Longman, who was chair of the School of Art and Art, director rather, of the School of Art and Art History from about 1939 onward. And during those last 2 to 3 years of Grant Wood's life, there was considerable tension, again, in part rooted in the homophobia that was rampant at the time, and something that Lester Longman frankly did not hesitate to use on occasion. Trip Evans' biography, excellent biography of Grant Wood, touches on this quite extensively. The differences certainly were more than over whether Grant Wood was gay or not. He certainly was, but also in terms of pedagogical approaches, Lester Longman just did not like Grant Wood, and he felt that he was not an appropriate fit for what Longman envisioned to be a program that would take on a very different approach. Grant Wood's approach of bringing in apprentices to learn the trade, as opposed to Longman's classical educational approach of art history and art criticism. The two were oil and water, and it was a very, very difficult time. But nonetheless, Grant Wood had allies. He certainly had his detractors, but ultimately was not a situation that worked out well for the school. The next slide, please. We're fast forwarding about 30 years now. The first really a truly visible action of Gay Liberation Front, which was formed in the fall of 1970, was this anti-homecoming queen float. And in 1970, of course, a great deal of protest was underway. The war in Vietnam was raging. Civil rights were at the forefront in terms of moving forward with Black Power. And also came the vocabulary of gay pride. And in the fall of 1970, for the first time, a public float was featured in the homecoming parade in Iowa City. We have an audio clip with Raymond Perry. Raymond is a retired attorney. He lives in Des Moines, and he was a founding member of Gay Liberation Front that fall. And in our oral history collection, we have this excerpt.
I've given you a picture of the float that we finally put in the homecoming parade at the University of Iowa. And I thought at the time, I thought, my gosh, what am I doing? I'm gonna get beat up. You know, the fear was palpable. To be in a parade and identify yourself as being gay, that I thought was, I still think was at that time and place was quite courageous.
Indeed, it was very courageous. And that same semester, the University of Iowa student government voted to appropriate, I think, $200 for programming for the newly formed Gay Liberation Front. And that action, with the support of the university administration under President Sandy Boyd, made it the first officially recognized LGBTQ organization in the country on a university campus. The next slide, please. The Daily Iowan, also during the fall of 1970, ran a groundbreaking 5-part series on gay liberation. Here are a couple of samples. You can find these online as well if you want to look up these articles in more detail later by going to dailyowan.lib.uiowa.edu. That's our Daily Iowan archive. And you can search by date, you can search by text. These particular articles were published in the fall of 1970. And Bill Kapp was the reporter for the DI at the time who wrote about his experiences attending a gay social at the IMU. The next slide, please. In that story, if you read it in more detail, you'll note the great trepidation that people had at that time to attend their first gay social, and the idea that you're maybe circling around outside the door, maybe outside the building. You're looking rather furtively at others to see if they are going as well. You're thinking to yourself, are they or aren't they? It was a time of great anxiety and I think great exhilaration, and it's summed up in these in this series of 5 articles by Bill Kapp. The next slide, please. During the emergence of gay liberation in Iowa City, of course, was the second wave feminist movement, which took root at about the same time, both on and off campus at the university and in the Iowa City community. This is a publication that originated in Iowa City and enjoyed national distribution throughout the 1970s. Ain't I a Woman? And it's based on the public statements of Sojourner Truth. And this comes from a collection in the Iowa Women's Archives, which is also located along with the university archives in the main library. Aiden, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll pitch in whenever you want, but you've got some material to share as well.
Yeah, so thank you, David, for the great history thus far of the kind of pre-1970s and leading into gay life on campus. And one of the dichotomies I think David has already highlighted in the shift to this cover of Ain't I a Woman, the first publication out of the Iowa City Women's Liberation Front in 1970, is this dichotomy between campus, gay life on campus, and lesbian life, which I would argue is predominantly in the Iowa City community at this time. Although many people are affiliated with campus, the only sanctioned student organization on campus during this era is Gay Liberation Front in the early 1970s. But the Iowa City Women's Liberation Front published this first issue of Ain't I a Woman on June 26 in 1970. And the collective in this issue actually acknowledges that the first issue was too Iowa City centric in their worldview, and they certainly hope to encourage submissions from across the Midwest. So we're seeing this emerging notion of like, what does queer and women-centric regionality look like in the 1970s, and how can publishing, one arm of communicating and creating community together, be an effective way to gather. They guaranteed feminist organizations throughout the region, printing full-page layouts without editing any content to give space, voice, and autonomy to other feminist and lesbian communities around the Midwest. But one of the key things that Ain't I a Woman does culminate in is the founding of the Iowa City Women's Press. And this was actually because Ain't I a Woman attempted to publish an issue about women's anatomy through the University Publishing Services a couple years later in 1972, and that publication was actually denied, and Print Services excluded an excerpt of what they had in their content for that issue, and that led the Iowa City Women's Liberation Front to decide that they needed to start publishing on their own, and so they birthed the Iowa City Women's Press. The Iowa City Women's Press was founded with two key principles: to help women gain control over the printed word and to equip women with the skills to combat income inequality. And in the Iowa City Women's Press in Dyke, a quarterly was touted as a lesbian press collective. Lesbian run, the press prioritized growing the skill sets of all women, both through working at the press and their publications. So the press originally started in a garage in the 1970s and moved around Iowa City and published things such as the famed Greasy Thumb Auto Mechanics Manual for women. And what I think we see between Iowa City Women's Press and the various publications, along with student organizing on campus, is this shift towards a regional gay identity or regional gay and lesbian connections. And this is certainly exemplified through the Midwest Gay Pride Conference that first started and was held at the IMU in 1974. This conference led to other publications and ways for LGBTQ people to meet one another throughout the region in the 1970s, and most notably out of the 1974 conference emerged a publication, RFD, often known for the acronym Rural Free Delivery. It was a gay countryman's journal that started in Iowa City and was printed by the Iowa City Women's Press, but has since 1976 has been published around the country in other gay, rural, and farm collectives. But there's a shift that's happening between the 1970s into the early 1970s to the late 1970s and early 80s, where the radicalism that you see in the gay liberation movement is starting to diminish and change over time as more social inclusion is advocated for, different forms of rights, and certainly a shift in what we come to know and understand as this era of protest in the 1960s and 70s. And so I'd like to share another oral history excerpt from an interview with alumni Michael Blake about this era and the shift from a more radical gay liberation front on campus.
And so when I finally came out, Gay Liberation Front had sort of fallen into disarray, as a lot of organizations do, especially on campus, where there's this 4-year cycle of people. you get you go through 4 years and you're active, and then the wheel has to be reinvented a lot of times with campus organizations that I discovered over the years. But anyway, so for a lot of reasons, and at the time, I think the initial exuberance and confrontation of the gay rights movement in the country had sort of that huge tsunami had sort of passed, and so then across the country started to be okay, we need to start providing services for the community, since the rest of straight society is not doing it. Gay Liberation Front sort of like reappeared as the Gay People's Union, which even by its name, I think, indicated that there was a different focus, on activism.
And so Michael Blake is certainly articulating the way that the needs and resources of the gay and lesbian community on campus and also regionally and nationally is shifting. And so that's the first time that we get a name change in this long lineage of name changes we'll share out for Gay Liberation Front to Gay People's Union on campus. To Gay People's Union on campus. And you see the variety of services through this ad for Gay People's Union that they're providing, including a magazine, a speakers bureau. We're already starting to move, and I know David will contextualize the AIDS epidemic shortly. And this is a slightly later, obviously, document from the 1980s. But there's an array of kind of social and communal and service-oriented things that the Gay People's Union is shifting towards as they develop as an organization and meet the needs of students on campus. And one of the key reasons, here's some other Gay People's Union and some of the name shift Gay Lesbian Association records here. But one of the key sources of support that they're providing is actually through this service called Gayline. And Gayline was a phone hotline that did begin early with Gay Liberation Front in the 1970s, but clearly becomes one of the central purposes of the Gay People's Union throughout the 1980s as well. And people could call in to receive resources and information about Gay People's Union, but that it could learn so much more about events in the community, resources available, talk to someone about coming out, talk to someone about sex and safe sex. They could, really get an array of resources and materials both on campus and across Iowa. And I'd say one of the most interesting things from working with the Gay People Union records, which are now the Glibtail records, as cited on the bottom, is that they were building this extensive archive of resources so that when people called in with any query for folks to answer and try to respond to, that they had pamphlets and brochures from resources and community information, right? This is before Google. And so I think obviously Gayline is serving as some form of kind of LGBT Google in the 1980s for resources that weren't just limited to campus. But Gayline certainly highlights that campus resources were limited for LGBT students and faculty and staff. And so this was a clear resource for people to phone in anonymously and gather information that they most needed in times of crises, but also I'm sure times of just gathering and joy. What a resource to have. But I want to draw our attention back to the community, because I do think there's this continual dichotomy between gay organizing on campus and lesbian activism in broader Iowa City. And so founded around this connection, or around this time in connection, is the Lesbian Alliance. And the Lesbian Alliance was formed in 1973 to meet the political, cultural, and social needs of lesbians. And they immediately began publishing Better Homes and Dykes, which you see on this cover, to share local community news and resources and information about things including their dances, concerts, coffee house meetings, workshops, softball games, and picnics, as well as different forms of counseling and support services. And circling back and moving through our press and publication history, which I think in Iowa City is vast for LGBTQ organizations, the Iowa City Women's Press begins publishing Common Lives, Lesbian Lives, a lesbian feminist quarterly in 1980 or 1981. And what's interesting about Common Lives, Lesbian Lives moving to Iowa City is that they in fact moved to Iowa City to publish this journal, the original founders. Although they were from Los Angeles, they spoke with different periodical co-founders of Sinister Wisdom that was putting out a call for more publications by and for lesbians to be produced in the 1980s. And they chose Iowa City because of the Iowa City Women's Press and the legacy of the only women-owned and operated printing press that did their own setting and binding as well for publication. And so Common Lies, Lesbian Lives moves to Iowa City and begins publishing, and actually outlasts the Iowa City Women's Press, which closes in 1985, and Common Lies, Lesbian Lives remains in print until 1995. And I'll invite David back.
Thank you, Aiden. Tess Catalano's papers housed at the Iowa Women's Archives reveal, I think, the activism of a member of the Lesbian Alliance. Tess Catalano unfortunately died at a young age. She was only 39. But her legacy in Iowa City was very pronounced, very strong. Her papers included her passport, a number of personal effects concerning her enterprises at the time, including her licensed massage business. The next slide, please. She was also an organizer, a key organizer of the Women Take Back the Night marches, which occurred beginning in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And so a number of documents pertaining to that assertion of the larger women's community, but specifically lesbians who had spearheaded this activism. The documentation in Tess Catalano's papers is very, very clear. The next slide, please. And as Aiden pointed out, this is a part of the trend as Gay Liberation Front matured into Gay People's Union and became more service-oriented. By this time, Gay People's Union advocated for the addition of courses to be added to the curriculum in trying to remember the department, sociology, I believe, which carried this particular course documenting the history of the gay liberation movement in the United States. This happened in 1982, but even prior to that, there had been similar offerings. The next slide, please. I mentioned early on the historic step that the University of Iowa took in providing benefits and healthcare coverage for same-sex unmarried partners. In 1993, when this policy was adopted, it was not legal for gay people to marry. That would not happen until the Iowa State Supreme Court issued its historic ruling in 2009. But during this interim period, if you will, before we could become legally married, there were provisions among some employers, including the University of Iowa, among the first, if not the first, actually in the United States, to provide coverage for domestic partners. Professor Pat Kane was instrumental in the implementation of this policy back in 1993. The next slide, please. And again, as Aiden mentioned, the demands for services evolved over time with the emergence of the AIDS crisis, beginning in 1981 with the first reports of documented cases of AIDS in the United States, a caseload that grew exponentially in the years to follow, with a very, very slow, if not outright, resistant response at the state and federal levels. The university was in its way not responsive, and it took, again, this is, I believe, in Michael Blake's oral history interview, he recounts how difficult it was for the AIDS advocacy group on campus to secure support, adequate support from the university for distribution of condoms, for distribution of free information on safe sex, a number of services that were essentially done by the goodness of volunteers, at least early on. And student health, as recounted in Michael Blake's interview, student health services for a period of time was very resistant to offering that type of community support training. So as was often the case, it fell upon the community to address the issue itself. And so the Johnson County AIDS Coalition, along with the Gay People's Union, joined forces to provide support training and other services during the 1980s. Next slide, please.
So now we're shifting ahead yet again in time, but I think it's important to mention from the 1980s through to the early 2000s, Gay People's Union changed their names a number of times, and that certainly reflects the ways that the LGBTQ community is both growing in our understanding of gender and sexuality, but also a unification of gay and lesbian activism and student organizing on campus. So in 1988, Gay People's Union becomes the Lesbian and Gay People's Union, and the following year, in 1989, it's renamed again as Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual People's Union. And then in 2001, we get the name that the archival collection is named after, which is the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, and Allies Union. So we're seeing the shift in growth in the community and our own understanding of who is encompassed in what we now understand as the LGBTQ community. And I think a really important marker on our campus is, of course, as pictured here, the opening of the Pride Alliance Center, which was originally the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Resource Center here on campus in 2006. One of the things I would like to highlight is that there's an array of student organizations that have appeared and have essentially maybe been more short-lived than the Gay People's Union, which has since become Spectrum UI, and most notably now Queer Liberation Front, paying homage at the 50th anniversary to the original Gay Liberation Front, where we started with our student organization history on campus. But I wanted to quickly highlight that there's been so many different both professional and intersectional identity-based student organizations on our campus in recent years, including UI Trans Alliance, which was founded in 2015, earlier organizations like Grupo LL from the 1990s that served lesbian, gay, Latinas, and Latinos on students on campus. House of Lord, which was for Black queer students in 2017 to 2019. But then we also have an array of professional-based identity organizations, including the Equal Meds for those in the medical school, OSTEM for those in science and technology, the Rainbow Readers, a reading group, Outlaws for those from the Law College, the LGBT plus advocates for public health, and also Reaching Out in Business. And so we see an array of student organizations that I wanted to at least highlight that they've had a presence on campus. Many still exist, but one of the challenges we see in collecting student organization material, particularly 1990s forward, is really the digital turn and the fact that student organizations begin to produce everything online and don't share as much physically with the archives. And then, of course, what this also exemplifies is there's still a lot more for us to do and to collect to understand our history. And so thank you. Kim shared in the chat a LibGuide for a new project called Student Organizations Archiving Their Records, SOAR, which hopes to overwrite some of the missing collections that we may have or some of the gaps in the archives and work to build a more inclusive student organization record on our campus. So for those of you who are alumni from any orgs, we would love to collect your material, whether they're LGBTQ organizations or not from your time on campus. But we're also working hard to find new ways to work with student organizations and acknowledge the queer history in the making on campus. The photo on the screen I felt was very relevant to share. It's from the Trans Day of Visibility rally back in March of 2021, nearly a year ago. But how appropriate that this photo beckons the call that trans kids belong in sports as we sit here in Iowa with the recent law that Governor Reynolds did sign in. So it reminds us of the work and the continual work that we need to do, not just to collect the present, but to do what David and I have done and share the long history of LGBTQ folks in Iowa.
Thank you, Aiden. We'll close with a quotation from James Baldwin, and I think this is a note that we would like to leave you with before we get to your questions. We have a few minutes left. Know from whence you came. If you know whence you came, there are absolutely no limitations to where you can go. History is not a procession of illustrious people. It's about what happens to a people. Millions of anonymous people is what history is about. And on that note, Aiden, thank you very much. Doug and Tristan, I believe one of you can share with us any questions that members of our audience may have. And also, as we close, I wanted to mention two people you can contact for more information about our local LGBTQ history. Aiden's email is up there. And Janet Weaver. Janet is the curator of the Iowa Women's Archives, and her email address is also on the screen.
Thank you, David and Aiden both. That was impressive. I learned a lot. So thank you very much. So we have about 6 minutes left. I don't, want to do one last call. I don't see anything in the Q&A right now, but if you would like to ask a question from David or Aiden, and we have one. Thank you very much for the question. So the question reads as follows. Do you have any records about the 3 strikes issue with the Board of Regents? I think it was in the 1990s when there was an uproar over depiction of gay sex in the German language class.
That sounds like the Taxi zum Klo controversy. It was a German language film that was screened in a film studies class, if I understand correctly. I think that's what the questioner is asking about. We do have a clippings file about it. There were numerous newspaper articles about it at the time. And also there should be records about it in the records of the New Wave Party. That was a progressive student organization that was deeply involved in UI student government from the late 1970s until the early 1990s. And I believe the New Wave Party had been involved as, if not as formally as a litigant to abolish the censorship policy, but to at least advocate for the abolition of that policy. So I believe there would be records of it in the New Wave Party and also in the records of the Board of Regents. There would be minutes of the Regents that are managed by not the University Archives, but by government information. The Government Information Unit in the main library can help you with that if you are interested in pursuing that. And the minutes are physically arranged by date. I don't know if they are online going back that far. I do know that I think from about 2005 forward, at least, the Board of Regents maintains their minutes online.
I also wanted to share that we have the Campaign for Academic Freedom records. I dropped the link for both New Wave Party and the Campaign for Academic Freedom, as they were very vocal about the right to show explicit films and other content in class context in the early 1990s. So I'm not 100% sure if they're responding to this specific incident, but I wouldn't be surprised, and I know they were affiliated with New Wave as well.
Thank you both. Next question we have from the audience here. What roles have the UI Healthcare's LGBTQ Medical Clinic and the LGBTQ Counseling Clinic and the UI's College of Education played in Iowa's history? Does this make Iowa more of a Mecca?
That's a very good question. That is, I'm afraid, a bit outside my wheelhouse, but in terms of the College of Education, I don't know if I would be out of line for inviting Lois to speak to that, but I see now she just posted on the chat line a couple of resources. Lois Gray, who has helped arrange today's session is the Director of Strategic Communication for the College of Education. So she has the answer for you there. So check out that information on the chat line.
I would also share that the LGBT health clinic is certainly a leader in the country. And on one hand, yes, I think I know personally of a lot of people who in some senses make the pilgrimage to receive healthcare in Iowa City, and the fact that the clinic does serve the broader Midwest at minimum. But one of the other things that they're certainly doing is training the future generation of LGBTQ health professionals, and in developing both surgical procedures, but also providing consent-informed care. So it certainly does set, I think, a tone for the country and the nation, and help Iowa's great medical school put out wonderful alumni who are doing LGBTQ inclusive healthcare work. But I think too, a question that we have from an attendee next about our deep understanding of history, and what can we do better to inform Iowans of the harm caused by recent legislation. It's this visible discussion and communication of the rich queer history and resources that we do have in the state of Iowa that we need to continue doing. And so sharing out the history, the long history that we've had, sharing out personal stories through oral history work, which has been central to both my career and David's. And I think for other people, if you're not in the history or archival professions, sharing the story, sharing these links, sharing what you've learned today with others, and talking about the resources that many of you may want to be very proud of for being a part of the University of Iowa's history, and speaking to people about, why you care about Iowa's LGBTQ population, and particularly trans folks and trans youth, who are, of course, most at risk and really central in the political conversations today.
All right, great. Unfortunately, we are at time, and so I want to thank David and Aiden so much for their time today. I hope everyone that was able to join us learned a little something and enjoyed their presentation as much as I did. I thought it was fantastic. Can't think of a better way to kick off our LGBTQ alumni group. So thank you all so much for that. And thank you all for coming. We will have this recording posted on our website, which was linked into the chat. So if you know of others who weren't able to attend, or if you just want to go back and look at things and find more resources, or rewatch parts, you can find that on our website. So thank you all so very, very much. And with that, on Iowa, go Hawks. Have a great evening, everyone.